You're listening to a CNA podcast.
When I was growing up in the countryside in Australia, there were farms all around. There were wheat and canola and barley fields, and the idea for me of what a farmer was reasonably clear. That's changing. We have to grow food in new ways now, not just in the fields, but in our cities. Today, we're unpacking the vertical farming revolution. Hi, and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Jack Board, and hello, Liling Tan in Singapore. Liling, in your mind, what does a farmer look like? I hear you have a bit of a green thumb.
Oh, I wish. What does a farmer look like? Well, okay, for a while it looked like me, at least when I was back in the US gardening. We had a friend with a little farm in New Jersey that we used to go to quite often during the weekends, and we would grow squash, eggplant, okra, potatoes, kale, and lots of tomatoes, from your cherry tomatoes to your heirloom tomatoes. And the four seasons there in that time zone or in that part of the world, it's really satisfying to be able to plant your seeds in the spring and then watch them grow over the summer, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and then to be able to harvest them when fall comes. It's really satisfying and it's good fun. Here in Singapore, not so much though. It's too hot. It's too wet. It's too humid. Jack, you've heard me complain numerous times about my plants before and how they keep dying here. Everything dies. Even my worms for vermicomposting are dying. I mean, I spend good money on these worms. They're called African night crawlers, and they're supposed to produce compost. But all they do is just boil or cook in this heat. It's like a mass extinction event in my worm bin. It's just horrible.
Now I'm picturing you wearing like your overalls and your straw hat and you've got something in between your teeth. Is that the vibes?
Yeah, exactly that. And I've got the farmer tan lines, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, this is painting a picture for me that, hey, farmers aren't what we always thought they were. And even if your farms aren't very successful from the sounds of things, like growing food in our city is something we have to learn to do. And people are starting to do it more successfully than what you are doing right now.
Yeah, it goes to show how difficult it is to actually grow things here in this urban context too.
Exactly. And we'll get into that in a little bit. It's time for the weekly quiz. Now, you had a week off last week without a quiz. I bet you've been thinking about it. You're ready to go.
Life is just not the same without Jack Board's quizzes.
Correct. The week before that, though, where we were talking about how many liters of water were being used to make like cups of coffee and tea. And I'm going to continue a little bit down that track. So we're going to focus on lettuce, though. You didn't mention lettuce in the vegetables that you like to grow. But normally, using conventional methods to grow 1 kilogram of lettuce, it takes about 300 liters of water for 1 kilogram of lettuce. And obviously, this figure will change in different places. But as an average, 300 liters. And I want to know today how much more water efficient growing that lettuce in a controlled indoor farm typically is. And it's going to be a multiple choice. So you've got A, about 5 times, B, 15 times, or C, 50 times more efficient.
By water efficient, you mean how much less water is used in vertical farming compared to regular farming methods, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Or grown in a variety of indoor methods. How much less water is being used?
Okay.
Answers at the end. Okay, it's news time. Liling, what stories have captured your attention from inside a very busy newsroom HQ?
Yeah, you know that oil spill off Singapore's southern shores earlier this month. We're still talking about that. It's still dominating headlines. We know this happened when a dredger, which is like an excavator boat, it hit a stationary bunker vessel that handles fuel and ruptured one of its fuel tanks. Now, this spilled about 400 tons of oil into the water, about half the tank. And in the first week, the slick stretched more than 30 kilometers, wrapping itself around the coastal waters. Now, Singapore's authorities responded by deploying booms to contain the slick, skimmers to collect the oil, and dispersants to break up the slick. Now, response was swift and efforts were taken to protect mangroves and other areas with fragile ecosystems and sensitive biodiversity. And these were preventive measures mostly. But despite all the swift response and the efforts that were being taken, the damage was visible. Jack, I don't know if you saw some of the pictures. We've seen oil covering waters where water sports usually take place, sludge washing up on shores where tourists usually gather, and of course local wildlife just completely drenched and drowning in it. Now, despite efforts to contain the damage, the ecological impact is evident. And Jack, we talk here in the podcast a lot about livelihoods. And many of these businesses that rely on tourism and water sports, they were badly hit because this happened during a long weekend. So they suffered huge losses as well.
Yeah, these were really jarring images, not being there, but just knowing those places and understanding Singapore to be such a clean place normally. But there has been some discussion about this low sulfur fuel that was spilled. Is that better than regular fuel from what you understand?
To some extent, yes, it does seem so. Now, I do understand that this low sulfur fuel is based on a mandate from the International Maritime Organization that went into effect 4 years ago. It basically imposed strict limits to the sulfur content in maritime fuel, reducing sulfur dioxide emissions and particulate matter, which is harmful to us. So theoretically, having a spill of low sulfur fuel might be better for human beings than the old regular oil. But while it might be less harmful to us, some research has found that it does very little or nothing for the planet and might even be making things worse.
Dilemmas everywhere we look. And, this is a story that is central to the green energy transition that we talk about and hear about all the time. I covered the aftermath of a huge oil spill in the Philippines last year. And the nature of the way we change our energy systems means there's high chances of having more of these types of vessels carrying toxic fuels on board, including LNG, which, let's hope we don't have a rupture of one of those vessels. And these are considerations that, governments have to consider when they think about their energy systems.
Absolutely. And, you brought up a really good point there about other types of fuel being used. There's a lot of talk about alternative maritime fuel, ammonia, for example. And a lot of these can be even more toxic or dangerous, depending on which ones they are. Part of the conversation has been about what kind of scenarios should we be thinking about when we start adopting some of these other alternative forms of maritime fuel and how dangerous they can be to humans and how far away they need to be from populated areas.
Yeah, not just emissions, but accidents as well.
Yeah.
Now, we also had some new statistics about Singapore's waste reduction and recycling, and it didn't seem like good news.
It's good and bad.
Okay, all right.
On the theme of winning some and losing some. So the good news from the National Environment Agency here is that Singapore is generating less waste, and we have been doing that over a 10-year period. So domestic waste is more than 15% down than it was in 2013. Yay.
Okay, that's good.
Right? And non-domestic waste from industry, for example, fell by over 30%. And that means both households and companies are making progress in reducing their trash. Now, the bad news is that recycling rates fell to 52% compared with 62% 10 years ago. And this was especially true for paper and cardboard, largely because of higher freight costs and commodity prices. Now, the recycling rate also fell from the prior year, mainly because of a lower amount of construction and demolition waste generated in the industry. Now, interestingly, almost all of this type of waste is usually recycled. So with less construction and demolition waste generated, there is less recycling. And Jack, 52% recycling rate, that's still quite far from Singapore's recycling target of 70% by 2030 in about 6 years' time.
Okay, but there was some good news there.
Some.
Yeah, recycling is a difficult issue and the whole world is facing it. But there's a target there. Let's see if we can reach it. All right, let's go to our main story this week. Late last year, I was in the Middle East and working on a story about the vertical farming revolution taking shape in one of the most challenging environments on the planet. When you're in Dubai, you don't have to travel far outside the inner city to fully understand how harsh the desert terrain is. So picture what seems like this endless rocky and sandy expanse that ripples with heat. And I spoke to a World Bank consultant at the time who said trying to grow food out there was like trying to grow food on Mars. Liling, have you spent much time wandering the desert in your time?
Yeah, I don't know if Southern California counts. I spent some time in Joshua Tree National Park in Southern California. It straddles the Mojave Desert and the Colorado Desert. So that's like being in 3 different deserts at the same time. They have different ecosystems, interestingly. One is known for the twisted Joshua trees that it's named after, and the other one in Colorado is for the cactus, and the Mojave Desert for the cooler climate. But all of them desert, of course.
I don't think you or I have been growing food or trying to grow food in these types of places. It's problematic. On top of the issue of the difficulty of growing it, it means food security and sustainability become major considerations for countries like the UAE, which imports 85% of its food. Now, different terrains, but it shares similar goals and challenges with a country like Singapore, which also imports about 90% of its food. Both countries, and increasingly many others, have turned to high-tech farming and agricultural methods to boost local production. Here's part of an interview that I did with Stuart Oda. He's the founder of Alaska Life. It's an agriculture technology firm that's parented in Singapore, operating all over the world. And I think it's kind of instructional about the trends that are going on in this space.
I think maybe 2 things are happening. There's the younger generation is demanding things that are more natural, more healthy, more sustainable. And so there's a huge groundswell of demand for products that meet these requirements. And so there's a huge pull for technology that's enabling food to be grown more locally with less pesticides, less chemicals, that are more nutritious. So there's one side on the demand side. On kind of the urgency side of things, we're talking about like once in 100-year, 500-year, 1,000-year storms happening every year now. And so, unfortunately, the climate is making it difficult for traditional farms to be able to kind of grow and be business as usual. And so indoor farming and ag tech is, out of just sheer necessity, is becoming important for to even meet our current and maintain our current level of production, not even talking about expanding our current level of production. And so the other thing is like major trends like urbanization. There are another 1 billion people moving into cities. In emerging markets, up to 40% of those people are linked to the food production supply chain, which means that, conservatively anywhere between 100 to 400 million farmers are going to move to the cities and no longer be working in the fields, which means that I think there's a lot of concern that the success of this kind of technology is going to be taking jobs away from farmers. But the reality is that they would rather be a taxi driver in the city than be a farmer in the fields. And so in order to make sure that the remaining farmers are superhuman in their productivity requires a lot of help technologically. And so we're hoping to supplement the remaining farmers, but also, with technology like this to inspire the next generation of food producers, in the middle of the city that's going to be growing food for their own communities.
So, in short, climate change is adding obstacles, but it's also fast-tracking investments in vertical farming facilities. Also in Dubai, I visited a place called Bustanica. It has an affiliation with the airlines Emirates, which at the time had claims as the largest vertical farm in the world. Now, it was this fairly massive operation. I got to tour around. It was growing all sorts of vegetables, 3 tons of leafy vegetables every day. Now, a leafy vegetable doesn't weigh much. So 3 tons of it, that's a lot of food.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and it's in this environment where temperature and humidity and water flow and nutrients are all controlled. And that's the point, right? The farm uses a fraction of the water and land required by conventional operation. And before we move to our part of the world, I should also mention that more is in the works in the UAE. They have another company, it's Dubai-based Food Tech Valley, They signed an agreement at the COP28 climate conference to develop an 83,000 square meter gigafarm. That's what they call it. And it's going to grow 50,000 tons of food per year. So that's the equivalent of 2 billion plants. Now, this is huge scales of production.
Wow.
And they're aimed at tackling the serious food issues that the world is contending with.
Right. And you mentioned COP28. You're likely to recall that at this summit, more than $7 billion was raised for, quote, climate positive action in the food systems sector. Basically, it's to help global food systems fight climate change. And that was led by former Indonesian President Joko Widodo, and timely, given that food production is responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions. A third, about 30%. And while increasingly, it's also being threatened by worsening droughts and unpredictable weather patterns. Now, I think we really undervalue the climate impact of food production. Experts say we can decarbonize the world's energy systems by going 100% renewable energy, but yet we can't keep temperatures in check because of the way we grow food, which is such a basic low-tech need. So I'm expecting food to be even more front and center at COPs as we go forward at these climate summits, especially with all this talk of high-tech solutions like vertical farming.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. So let's dig into the tech a bit, and then also what's happening in Asia. Answer me this, Liling. Is this technology actually producing positive results in Southeast Asia in particular, from what you've seen, what you've been reporting about? And is it proving to be this silver bullet that we need to push the needle on both carbon emissions and food security concerns?
Yes and no. I think without getting too deep into the technology, what it does is it really provides a controlled environment. Vertical farming provides a really controlled environment that is data-driven. You can track the data, you can track the conditions. So it really allows the operators to fully manage the surrounding in which these produce are being grown. Now, when I talk about vertical farming, I think I also need to be clear that we're not really including the regular rooftop garden farming concepts that we often see in cities. Vertical farming, as we know it, is high-tech. It is mostly indoors in a controlled environment like I talked about. And that means it uses artificial temperature, it uses light, water, and humidity that are controlled. It can be in a warehouse and it can be stacked. I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about these stacked vertical farms where it's multiple floors on one single plot of land, so reducing the need for more space, especially in areas that are land scarce.
Yep.
The problem is how energy intensive it can be. I mean, to basically create artificial sunlight or grow lights. And it makes it very hard to compete when it comes to pricing against other more traditionally grown produce, including imported ones. So this is raising questions about their viability in the short to medium term, especially for an industry that's still considered rather nascent. Now, one of our reporters at CNA's Singapore desk was recently in the Netherlands, which is known as one of the pioneers of modern vertical farms. She was there to see technology that may have applications here in the Singapore context. Here's her takeaway.
So vertical farms are big business in the Netherlands, but it's a mixed bag when it comes to the pricing of their products. That's largely due to the cost of operations when running these farms. Vertical farms are at the mercy of water and energy prices. Some of these companies cannot sustain. So one vertical farm I spoke to in the Netherlands recently acquired another company nearly going bust in Singapore. That raises the question of how profitable they can be today. Many of the technology used in the Netherlands is advanced, like automated systems and digital twins, and a lot of the farms in Singapore are already looking to adopt such technology in the coming months. But the price point of products from vertical farms in Singapore are still considered high by many, even with such technology. And unless it can compete with other imported farm produce from Malaysia or Thailand, demand will remain an issue.
Vertical farms are seeing their own version of cancel culture here in Singapore. In May, we heard that IFFI closed its 38,000 square meter facility here. And that site was said to have a capacity to produce 300 tons of vegetables a year. How many tons were you talking about at the vertical farm you visited?
50,000 tons.
Oh, wow. So this is a fraction of that, but still quite large. And in April, local company Verti Vergis reportedly nixed plans to build what would have been one of the country's largest indoor farms as well, 6 tons a day of greens. But it couldn't construct the facility in time. And it's not just Singapore and the Netherlands, Jack. It's happening in the US as well, a big market for this. We've seen closures in New Jersey and Detroit, even as other cities are betting big on it. So like Claudia said, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I think the energy intensity discussion is a really interesting part of this as well. Like speaking to operators, they say that these systems are getting far more sophisticated. They are becoming more efficient in the ways that they work. But as you add extra parameters, of course, it makes the system potentially more technical. And you start to increase the barriers between who can actually operate these types of facilities. And we also go back to what we're talking about, the energy mix. If you're having to pay for high energy bills as a result of the way your country produces energy, then you're going to put these types of industries in a disadvantageous position. But communities and areas that are producing excessive amounts of renewable energy, it's perfect for these types of operations. So it's a matter of kind of placing the solution where you need it and where good options exist. So where to next? I think with the rush of different technologies and different players and ideas, it'll be interesting what options actually end up sticking. You've mentioned those different facilities that haven't stuck, but I definitely see this as a growth industry. I also think there's great merit in trying to make sure in certain markets that the innovation that's happening in the vertical space can actually be translated or adapted to traditional fields, because that is where most of our food requirements will be met. It's undeniable. Singapore may end up being a slightly different example, but for everybody else, these large countries with huge amounts of arable land, that's where the steepest challenges exist and where climate change is really impacting. So a meeting of the minds, in a sense, should be the way to go, I hope.
I think it really is kind of a matter of when and not if, because we really need the solution. We can't depend on traditional farming because of the impacts of climate change like you were talking about. So we do need solutions.
Okay, quiz time. Repeating the question for you. How much more water efficient is growing 1 kilo of lettuce in a controlled indoor farm, typically compared to conventional farming? A is 5 times, B about 15 times, C about 50 times.
50. I'm going to go with 50. Knowing you, it's got to be the most far out crazy answer. So 50.
Li Ling, you're playing the player. You're not playing the game. The answer is about 15 times. 15 times.
Damn.
Hydroponic lettuce uses around 20 litres of water versus around 300. But as we've discussed, that's not the only consideration. When we throw in all the other metrics, the energy, etc.
15 isn't a lot, though. I thought it would be considerably more because I knew the water thing. I mean, it's touted as, less water intensive,
Well, if you want 50 times, we're talking about 6 litres of water. So let's go and ask those operators that we won't be impressed until you've got it down. Li Ling won't be impressed until you get it down to 6 litres.
That's right. Get your act together, guys. Come on. Clock is ticking.
All right, that's it for Climate Conversations this week. Thank you as always for your company. Remember, every Thursday we have a new episode.
Thanks for joining us. Do come back again soon next week. Ciao for now. I'm Liling Tan.
And I'm Jack Board. Thanks as well to the team that put together this podcast: Tiffany Ang, Janani, Joe Hari, Crispina Robert, and Sai Ye Win.